So welcome to this webinar on creating successful entrepreneurial ecosystems. Today we'll be having a conversation with Professor Dan Breznitz. So before we dive into content, let me start with a few housekeeping rules. So first of all, we're going to have a structured discussion with Professor Breznitz for the first half an hour. My colleagues Raffaele and Giulia will be leading the discussion. Then we will open the discussion for the Q&A. So please type your questions on the chat. I will be asking and posing the questions directly to Professor Breznitz. And lastly, please keep your microphone on mute so we avoid any background noise. And this meeting is, of course, recording. You will be able to see the recording in YouTube in a few days. So with that, let us start. I know that Professor Breznitz has very interesting insights to share with us about innovation policy. So I'm sure we're all eager to hear about this. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to Raffaele and Giulia. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Giulia Marsan from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. I'm based in Indonesia, and we have been partnering with EECOLE from the very beginning, and now very much actively throughout the EECOLE steering group. We are extremely happy to have with us today Professor Dan Breznitz from the University of Toronto. He's a worldwide expert on innovation policy and at the Munk Chair of Innovation Studies, and the co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab. But because we are lucky to have Professor Dan with us for 45 minutes, let's start immediately with our conversation, and let's start with the basics. Dan, can you please define innovation for us, and what are its main characteristics, the main actors, and also its diversity of approaches? Over to you.
First, thank for being here with me at very different time zones, and I hope you hear me well. I think that the most important thing, as you said, is to actually define innovation. And let me start by saying that there is a massive difference between innovation and invention. Okay, so if invention is the act of coming up with ideas, innovation is the act of taking ideas and putting them into reality. And when we're talking about economics and the market, we are talking about taking ideas and making them into new or better products and services. And it starts from the first act of coming with a novel product and service, move all the way through the production chain of both products and services. So recombining them, figuring out ways to make them better, figuring out way how to produce them better, figuring out way how to sell them better, and after service, and etc., etc. It is two of the most important things that you realize when you do that. I would say actually three. One is that the most impact, if you care about human welfare, is not in the act of invention. So let's just think very carefully about what we're doing now. This technology called teleconferencing is at least 50 years old. And I'm sure that there have been people here that even 10 years ago, when we were offered to do teleconferencing, we would do everything in our power to avoid it, because we would have to go to specialized rooms. I remember working with Cisco and their greatest invention that was supposed to be really good teleconferencing, and each room would cost about $1.5 million. And the product was very iffy. And yet when COVID happened, we basically, all of us opened Zoom. The quality was quite good, and we continued life. And especially we continued education, offices, and all the rest. And even more importantly, we didn't even think about the price. When you see now webinar in Zoom, it's like opening the light in your room. It's a utility. And that's when really that technology of teleconferencing changed human life and reached people all around the world. not in the first minute when somebody thought about this, but after at least 50 years, and God only knows how many hundreds of millions of engineering, R&D to improve each and every part of the subset technologies, but in the end, we can offer some. And we can go again and again. Second thing is, if you think about the economy and you think about who actually innovate the economy, there's only two sets of actors. One is companies, and the second is individuals, which we tend to call them entrepreneurs. Innovation policy, therefore, anything that you want to do with innovation, needs to change the behavior of those two actors. And the third, and I think the most important thing, is we think we understand this, let's call it confusion between invention and innovation. And yet, in some of our most important infrastructure, there's a massive confusion. And I'll just mention one: patents. The patents are actually given to the inventor, because the whole patent system, and the modern patent system started in the Republic of Venice, we didn't think that there would be a difference. And yet now it creates massive distortion in the market, which we can talk about them in a different seminar about the problems of IPR. And I'll stop here before I go on to one of my pet peeves.
Thank you very much. Then it's a great pleasure to hear from you on these topics. You are one of the few academics that is acquainted with theory and practice, because you spent the last year or more actually advising the government of Canada in the design and perhaps the implementation of the new innovation agency, the Canada Innovation Corporation. And for us, it's extremely interesting at this point to ask you, what are the things that you put in practice when designing this agency, and what are the different characteristics that you tried to implement, and so how this differs from conventional methods? Thank you very much. Then
I will unmute me because a host just muted me. Let's put it into perspective, okay? So one of the most important things that I think we all have to understand when we are doing innovation policy, especially when we think about the instruments that are supposed, the agencies, organizations that are supposed to do innovation policy, that it is very context specific, both in terms of where you locate them, the country, the region, and what happens there, and what is a business structure, what are the companies, what are the capacities, but also what is the mission that you want to achieve as a society, as a community with innovation. And you have to have a fit with those two, okay? In the context of Canada, at the federal level, we realize that we have a severe problem. And the severe problem is that Canada is the only OECD country that since 2001, no matter what proxies you use to measure it, there have been a disengagement of a private business with knowledge, not just innovation. So we all use BARD, Business Investment R&D. Canada is the only OECD country and G7 country that year after year since 2001 has a lowering BERD, which is now below 1%. To put it on perspective, Canada moved from being sort of average and actually going up to now being slightly below Poland. The Human Development Index, Canada used to be #1. It's now around number 16. All the other countries that were top 5 are top 5. Complexity Index, Canada is going down. All of this at the time that Canada higher education and research infrastructure actually grow from strength to strength. And the human capital, if you look at the skills in the labor force of the Canadian economy, is top bar none. So massive mismatch. And in those years, it's not as if the Canadian government never knew that this happened until the last 2 years. There have been massive amount of very specific programs. Okay, so instead of trying to see this as a structural problem, a way to think about it is Canada tried a lot, about 180 different kinds of program that we counted, probably more. So a cluster problem, an AI problem, and but instead of understanding that this is a structural problem and being very humble, meaning we have tried 180 different kinds of things and they did not work. They didn't even move the needle. So we need, and a lot of them, by the way, didn't move the needle because they still focused on, incubator, accelerators, universities, never admitting that the problem is in the private sector. So we did two things. We said we are going to admit that the problem is the private sector, and that's what we have to fix. If we want to move the median wage and productivity up, I wouldn't even bore you with how bad productivity in Canada is becoming. So an agency which is focused on the broad mission, but very focused. And the mission is creating more R&D leading to exportable services and products in the private business in Canada. Okay, that's the mission. Humble, because we actually said we tried all those things. We're not sure what's going to work and what's not going to work. So we are going to create an agency that will try a lot of different programs, basically be able to experiment. So unlike what Canada did in the past, which is a program, and you could look, the cluster initiative, it has now 3 names. You could look at the thousands of pages of regulations around it. The CIC, when and if it will actually be allowed to work, would be able to very quickly come with programs, basically regulations, scale up what works, cut down what doesn't. And because we also realize that this is a long-term structural program, we moved it as much as you can from the control of politicians, okay? Because if you want experiments, you cannot put it just below a politician, because a minister cannot afford more than one big failure, right? And what you want is actually a huge amount of failures. So you want to put it in a structure where when there's success, you invent the ministers and they cut ribbons, have a Photoshop, talk to the media, kiss babies. But when in the 60% where, you fail, it's all on the CEO of the CIS, of course. It's not the minister. So we created what's called a Crown Corporation, which is basically a company with a board and a CEO and a chairperson, which is budgeted by the government and has a public purpose. And we already talked about what the public purpose. So for the very first time in Canada, not in the world, you will have an agency with a board mission to deal with innovation, focusing on the agent of innovation, so companies and entrepreneurs, and with a demand to create what we will call a strategic unit, so a unit that actually figure out what the problem, evaluate them, develop new programs, and check whether those programs work or not, and run for multiple years. Preferably, we're in the OECD, we know how reality works, but as much as we can out of the direct control of the political masters and what happens in, the main newspapers in Canada. And I can only hope that it will start working soon, because it was supposed to start working already about a few months ago.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was very interesting to hear about this new Canadian Innovation Agency, its approach towards failure, and the very interesting programs you are currently planning. Now, in this last question before the Q&A segment, maybe we can continue a little bit along the lines that you have started to illustrate for us. I would like to ask you, what's your take on policy complementarities, both now, in the development of this agency, but also the lessons that you learned throughout your very long career? So policy complementarities, and also what lessons can you share for other OECD countries to be contextualized and applied? Thank you.
So I would, I came as a hard-nosed many years ago, academic who, this is innovation policy, boom, 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 everything is great, we just have. And I realized that one of the biggest problem, and I think especially about innovation, which is so broad, is that you actually, the first thing you want to do when you work with a community, and I say community on purpose, not a country, is to actually define a vision of a future. And I'm not talking about the vision of a future, which is, very vague, but define a vision of a future of how do you want your community to look like in 15 years. And in the case of when you talk about what we're talking about is, what industries you want to have, and especially in the global system we have now, and we haven't been able to talk about it, so maybe in the Q&A, one of the most important things that happened, right, is a fragmentation of production of both goods and services to different stages, right? Where you have, let's talk about semiconductors, as everybody knows after COVID, you look at, let's say, Silicon Valley, Seoul, Hsinchu, Taiwan, and China and Japan. You see all of them have great semiconductor industries. In many of them, it's the same companies. You might think it's the same industry, but you actually look at what they do, you realize very quickly that in every locale, they specialize in a very specific set of activities. So in Silicon Valley, they come up with new ideas to put in silicon. As now the whole world knows, there's only one place that actually know how to take those ideas and make them to silicon, more or less 1.5 companies, TSMC in Taiwan, maybe UMC. Every tablet, smartphone, or other high-end electronics that we buy, that no matter what the brand, the second highest profit goes to a Korean company because they focus on specific niches. And without the massive amount of innovation of how you work with constantly changing tens of thousands of components and materials around Shenzhen and Dongguan, we wouldn't have drones, smartphones, and all the rest in the price we can actually afford. So that means two different things that we should talk about them at some different point. One is that you have multiple opportunities to actually reach in your community innovation and its growth, and that each one of them actually have massive impact on equity and inequality and prosperity of your community. You're basically deciding who is going to win, who is going to have good jobs, and how many of those good jobs, and where and how the profits will be distributed. Which is again a reason why you have to have, and you want to have, a vision of what do you mean for your community when you want to have innovation-based success. How does it look like 15 years from now? Instead of saying, oh, I want to have a innovation-based growth, that means that we need more patent and more VC per capita because we need to look like Silicon Valley, which is basically like going to a rough, very rough sea with no compass or GPS, no map, and not even an idea where you want to go, so you'll just get lost. Once you have that vision, then I and you all the OECD and all the experts in the room, we can actually start thinking about reverse engineering of how, using policy, we might be able to reach that vision, where innovation policy is one of those tools. And that's what I would strongly urge people to think about when they come and people ask them about what should we do in innovation policy. Stop. Why? What is the aim of your innovation policy? Where do you want to reach? And be as pragmatic as you can. And then we can actually develop something that makes sense. If you want a lot of innovation policy because you have a Silicon Valley envy, good luck to you. When you fail for the next 15 years, come back to me and we can talk seriously. Over to you, Rafaela and Julia.
Thank you very much, Dan. This is music from our ears, because we strongly subscribe. We strongly support your words. I think now it's Maria that is going to animate and moderate the Q&A session, and I think is very dense.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a few questions that have come in. So the first one is Canada policy work connected to the EU Innovating Through Experimentation initiative for a collaborative innovation policy experiments? So basically, how does Canada's innovation policy connect with EU one? If you know.
So I can give you a short answer and then give you the long answer. The short answer is not really. It wasn't. It might, right? Because the agency now has a lot of leeway. But when we designed the agency, and I will have to say that the team that designed the agency came from 2 different ministries, and on top of them, 2 different ministers. So it was fast, but complicated. We looked at very specific cases, right? Cases of success, but at least those, as importantly, cases where we thought would have something in common with Canada. So I can tell you that one of the cases we looked at a lot, if you talk about the EU, is Finland, because you're talking about a case of a northern country with a kind of equity and equality that Canada aspires to. Very sparsely populated, and until the state intervened, very much resource-based. If you remember, not so long ago, the top leaders of the Finnish industry publicly and proudly proclaimed that Finland should not export anything which is smaller than a horse. And yet, Finland completely changed and is now very much an innovative economy. But even more importantly for Canada, it also innovates in the resource-based industry. So if you go to British Columbia and you look at the forestry industry, which is huge, you will find out that almost all the equipment there is actually Finnish equipment. And the only thing that British Columbia forestry and pulp industry does is grow the tree, cut them using equipment and other things that come from Finland and other countries, and ship them to China. So one of the things we try to look from Finland is how they infuse, not just how they develop, new startups and new industries, but how they infuse technology and relatively, and we can argue, and we are all academics, so it's good that we can argue. It creates more business for us, where Finland is more or less innovative in the pulp and paper than Sweden, but it's definitely more innovative than what it was, and definitely more innovative than Canada. And it was state-led. So we were trying to learn also those tools. In terms of experimentation, we didn't really look at what the EU is trying to do. But I think we ascribe to some of the same ideas, maybe less, I don't want to say rigid, but maybe less dogmatic, meaning we didn't specifically told the agency how they should experiment. We basically said more of a Chinese style, if you will. You're allowed to experiment and you have to have a strategy unit to develop it, but we are not going to tell you how.
Okay, thank you, Dan. That's very interesting to hear on how you also look at Finland. I know that in Newfoundland they rely very much on Memorial University and how they can infuse technology in a resource-based economy. I have another question. In your book Innovation in Real Places, you mention examples of countries that have relied heavily on venture capital, accelerators, the incorporation of company buildings, but these countries have not achieved a significant impact on human development over time, as you were mentioning this earlier. What policies do you think should be developed, considering that entrepreneurs who tend to grow are the ones who attract investors? What do you think should be the role of universities to initiate a change in this dynamic?
Okay, those are multiple questions.
Yes.
Let me simplify them. That's why I think it's important we understand, if you want to understand growth, you have to understand the global system, okay? And the changes in what we now call venture capital, and also the realization, as many of us who read the history of innovation and capitalism and growth, that venture capital is just the latest in a long tradition of financial vehicles or tools which we develop with different technologies at different times in different countries to how actually channel effectively, let's call it, capital into new businesses and new technologies, okay? Venture capital has changed significantly in the last 20 or 30 years. And right now, as I think we all know, it's the way venture, if you want to understand the impact on society, you have to understand how venture capital makes money. And venture capital makes money if in a very short, relatively speaking, period of time, the company they invest in is getting sold, have a financial exit, which is or at least an order of magnitude, they prefer 1000%. And that's a game. And there's only two ways in which you get this. Either you sell your company to a different company or you go to an IPO. Basically, you list on the public exchange, which is very rare. Okay? Once you do that, you also realize two other things. A, venture capital works and can make money in very, very, very narrow sectors. Right? You look at the history of modern venture capital, it's in ICT, more and more software. And after we change the laws of what you're allowed or not allowed to do, biotech. Almost nothing else. It also does it in a very, very specific ways. Again, because you can do that now. You will invest a huge amount of money in a startup consisted almost solely of engineers, assuming that all the production, even if you have to have a physical object, will not happen not by your company, because you don't want to invest in capital investment, and probably not even in your country. So what you create is, and Israel has been Israel and Silicon Valley, the transformation of Silicon Valley, but now also New York has been, the ideal type of this very unequal development. So you have a society, which is Israel, where you take the best of the best, so the people we shouldn't worry about, the graduate of the best universities, they get wages that are equivalent to Silicon Valley. So they will become millionaires with lottery ticket, basically stock options that might make them billionaires if there's a financial exit. The real aim of a game is not to develop a huge industry or a huge company. That's very rare. The real aim of a game is to find a financial exit for your investors in around 7 years. Their investors, a few lawyers, some celebrity chefs have the best times of their life. Almost no jobs are created for the other 85%. Because the only people that you're really interested in is R&D engineers, maybe a few marcoms. You run that system for about 40 years, you end up in a situation where Israel is, since we have the OECD. The OECD basically says that 1 of every 5 families in Israel doesn't have enough money to buy food at the end of the month. So for most Israelis, or significant amount of them, this miracle innovation growth was a catastrophe. Okay? Now, how do you change it? If you're already stuck in Israel, they're trying to change it, but it's difficult, right? You have an engined growth. But the way you can change it are several. A, you look at history. As I said, in every period, you have a financial vehicle to channel capital to new ventures and new technologies. Maybe it's time we think about something else, which is not venture capital, especially since venture capital does not work in anything which is not biotech and software. So, there's this other thing, which is called, there's equity, there's also debt. Maybe we should start thinking about those. Second, we already talked about those specific stages. Maybe we should be less obsessed about trying to have Silicon Valley in our backyard. Maybe it's much better to look like Switzerland or Taiwan if you care about your own citizens. So you want a lot of innovation, but not necessarily with the innovation that create new things to the world, but the innovation that actually makes sure that those innovations are produced in a more reliable way, in a lot cheaper way. You figure out how to combine them. You figure out niches from bicycles, all the new industries of how you can really control the industry and create jobs for, let's call it, a multiple types of skills. So more of your citizens can actually have a good job. I think I'm starting to pontificate, so I'll stop here. I will say that universities can play a role in that, but, and that's where I worry when I look at Canada and others, we also have to remember what universities are for. And if we ask universities to do everything on earth, especially all the things that the government has been miserably failing at, and also to teach, and also we might end up failing our own universities. And I think that Canadian University did a very bad choice in the past. About 15 years ago, they promised the government that they will fix all the innovation. And right now we're facing a severe political backlash from the same government that refused, which I think is a horrible mistake, but basically refused to increase their budget, claiming that they did not deliver on entrepreneurship. I don't know if you want your academics and your universities to be there. So be very careful what you promise your funding agency, because they might remember what you just promised 15 years from now.
Thanks, Dan. And I think the next question we have goes a little bit into that direction, and perhaps you can expand just very briefly. In your book, again, you say that firms and individuals are the true agents of innovation, and other players in the innovation space are at best enablers, at worst a distraction. We're quoting you. So what should those of us working outside the private sector, such as universities, do to ensure that we are enablers and not distractors? So perhaps if you want to continue to elaborate on the role of universities.
So the role of universities, if you want a real long discussion about the role of universities, you should invite other people who wrote a lot of books about that, because what you will get from me is what I read and understood from them. Okay? Let's just put it into perspective. I am more worried about not universities, but the tendency of a lot of government to, instead of focusing on changing the behavior of companies and entrepreneurs, go for the easy way and says, actually, we have no clue how to do that. So we are not going to give a huge amount of money for various organizations of questionable quality or questionable fit. Like, we will create a venture capital of 250 million in the middle of nowhere. And hey, we gave her money, goodbye. Instead of actually using the $250 million to build capacities and capabilities and companies. That's what I'm worried about. Okay, and I don't think I need to, especially to this crowd, to just remind all ourselves that we are very fashionable. We tend to have trends. So for a long while, everybody on earth will create a VC fund. Then that goes out of trend. Everybody on earth, no matter where they are, will try to do a university park. Then you will stop that and you will have accelerators because somebody in Silicon Valley managed to have a great accelerator with a great PR with maybe 3 companies that work. Instead of saying, here is the problem, here is what we are missing, here, not there, and here is the amount of money we have, let's figure out what we need to do in order to change the behavior of companies and entrepreneurs. Otherwise, we won't have growth and the creation of jobs. I saw a lot of notes, so I don't know what's happening, but I'll trust you.
No, the chat is very active, and thanks for bringing forward your approach to a more concerted approach to innovation and the real needs of the place. Perhaps just to complement your answer, there's another question in the chat. They ask what could be an optimal reference for a place-based innovation policy, since metropolitan regions seem to be better placed because of their attractiveness and feature. But yes, so perhaps rural, remote regions lag a little bit more behind.
Okay, so again, it's off the cuff. And I'll say 2 things. One of them is provocative on purpose. Okay? The first thing, because you mentioned Memorial and Newfoundland and Labrador. So if you look at the history of Newfoundland and Labrador in the context of Canada, this was the most remote, this was Iceberg Alley. This is the most remote province that actually did not join Canada until very late. Extremely low skills, very poor. Discovered oil, offshore oil, but in a very harsh environment, and I say iceberg. Used this to completely change the province. Okay, so it's not Norway by any means, but if you look at the prosperity, equity, level of skills, education, and how all of that flow from that industry, and also what kind of activities around the industry and then moving out of the industry happens in Newfoundland, it's an extremely impressive case. As a matter of fact, I don't know if many of you know, but the biggest ever exit of a fintech company in Canada did not happen in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. It happened in Newfoundland. And even more interestingly, the core technology that they have was actually for control of automated cars in mines, which then they found actually can help them to distinguish patterns of very small frauds. So we started working with credit unions and all the rest, because nobody wanted to work with a fintech company from Newfoundland, God forbid. And now in the end, they basically were bought by the New York Stock Exchange in order to be their fraud and money laundering unit and technology for multiple billions. So that's one. The second, slightly more provocative, if there's one thing that really worries me now, is that I don't see how we're going to have a green transformation, because we need an order of magnitude more mining. And it's not just esoteric, minerals. When critical minerals include things like copper and nickel, we're talking about massive amount of mining. I don't see how A, this is happening. B, I don't see how this is happening without those activities, unless we develop new technologies, create such an environmental catastrophe that no matter how many Tesla we buy, we end up in a worse environment. That's on the bad side. On the other side, you look at what a modern mine means, you look at the activities that you can create. There's no miners, by the way, that go underground. It's very technical. The average wages are actually higher than in the oil industry, at least in places like Canada. We're not talking about the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. And they are in extremely rural places, right? Because we basically mined everything around very disadvantaged communities. We have not done our fair share of work to figure out how we can turn this opportunity into really good work and sustainable development, both for the world, but also for those communities. This is, I wouldn't say generational, it's probably 1 in 100 years opportunity to really infuse rural communities that otherwise there is no way in, hell that we would pay them any attention. I'm not sure what to do. I just started to think about it. But I think this is the time where we just have to do that. Again, assuming you agree with me that we want a green transformation. So if we do that, we might as well do it in a way that offers the community a real future.
Thank you, Dan. Just the last question, because we have so many questions popping up, and please, for others, don't worry, we can follow up later, or we can put you in touch with Dan. What would you think could be the role of SMEs in innovation process? Because we talk a lot about Silicon Valley startups, but what about SMEs? Thank you.
So let's forget Silicon Valley for a moment. One of the examples I love is the Riviera del Brenta in Italy. And the Riviera del Brenta in Italy, the reason I love it is if you buy luxury, and when I mean luxury, I mean really high end, so several hundred euros to several thousand euros, women's shoes. No matter what the brand is, at some point your shoe visited the Riviera del Brenta. Because to simplify things, the Riviera del Brenta transformed itself through basically doing mass market shoes to the Taiwan of high-end shoe manufacturing. So everything that Taiwan does for semiconductors, Brenta does for fashionable female shoes. And there, what you see is a huge amount of SMEs. It's I don't want to call it classical Italian cluster like we used to read about in the 80s, but it is as similar as you have now. And it is that mash of suppliers that allow and specialize in those multiple set of activities that sustain Brenta through good times and bad times, also create significant amount of jobs for different skills. And they're all supported, and I think that's important for us, by organization institutions that are basically public-private. And in the history of Brenta, that's another reason why I like Brenta. A lot of the public policies actually started from the private sector that understood first that need to change. So you have a specific school for setting up of those skills. That schools also tie itself up to specific places where you have those ideas for design. You created expos. You figure out, we talked about finance, how and what is needed in order to finance those SMEs so they can constantly improve their equipment and technology, etc., etc., etc. So SMEs, I think, are crucial. And the moment you realize that there are other opportunities and not just, having a Silicon Valley obsession, what I used to call techno-fetishism, you realize that there are, in many cases, let's call it the heart and soul of what your community can be. But you need to figure out, because they're SMEs, how you constantly infuse knowledge and technology in them, how exactly they can participate in innovation, how you create other shared and public assets, public goods that they need and they can use, what kind of financial system they need, not the invented financial system that a McKinsey consultant from New York tell you, but what they actually need, and how you tie them into the global industry. Because we are talking about success, in order to survive, you have to have success in the global markets. And I'll stop here because I think I already took 3 minutes of your life that I promise not.
Thank you very much, Dan. This is a very interesting conclusion, final note on very targeted policies on how we can support SMEs. That is, we take well note, because we're here in the SME and Entrepreneurship division. So we have one last question. I don't know if Raffaele, okay, perhaps we should wrap up and then we can, Dan, let you follow up with a few interested and eager participants.
I'm passionate about those issues. So, and I'm now back in the universities, so you all can reach me, and there's no executive assistant that prevent emails from coming to me. I'm just slow because I'm teaching, but that's it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was a pleasure to connect. Thank you for your time. We are eager now to come to Toronto for the EECOLE roundtable. As you know, this was the last webinar that we organized to pave the way to this discussion, and we're very happy that we can consider ourselves on the labor-intensive side of innovation policy, because against the, as opposite as to the capital-intensive about Silicon Valley incubator accelerators, we care about communities, we care about connections, and we care about creating a better world through entrepreneurship. Thank you for connecting with us, and I hope to meet you in person very soon.
Ciao.
Ciao.